Good evening. You're very welcome. I'm Peter Dunn, and you're tuned into the first episode of our new Farming, Food and Rural Affairs panel discussion programme here on the Irish Inquiry channel, simply called Grassroots. So Grassroots is it's a new departure, we hope, in online agricultural programming as we embrace the dialogue that needs to take place in a rapidly changing farming landscape. With an increasing awareness of farming's impact on ecosystems and how working with nature we can produce abundant, nutritious food while ensuring we protect our natural resources, our landscape and our countryside for future generations. Now, Grassroots will be a farming magazine programme. We discuss topical, sometimes controversial issues that affect farmers and rural people. The focus as well will also be on practical farming techniques and practice, and what some people call regenerative farming, or how, as some people describe it, farming used to be, and how we can maybe take some of that old wisdom and old knowledge and apply it in the modern context. Grassroots will be about farmers, speaking to farmers about farming. So as we like to say here on the show, prepare the hot beverage of your choosing, tea, coffee, or not, as the case may be, but please do pull up a comfy chair, sit back, relax, and prepare to enjoy the next hour with us here on Grassroots. So without further ado, folks, we have a great panel lined up this evening, and I think we're hoping to have really an information-rich and a very interesting and informative discussion. And our panelists this evening are a lovely farming couple from just outside Callan in County Kilkenny, Jennifer and Stephen O'Reilly, and also John Deegan from outside Kilbeggan in County Westmeath, who is a farm accountant and a part-time regenerative farmer. Now, at the outset, I just would like to thank the Irish Inquiry for giving us this platform to engage in the discussion that we're about to have this evening, and also to thank them for all of the preparation and the background work that's gone in. As you can imagine, there's been quite a lot of detail and quite a lot of communication in the last few weeks to get this program off the ground. So, as I say, to the Irish Inquiry, a big thank you. So without further ado, we're going to move on because we've to compress quite a lot of information into the hour this evening. So first of all, if I can come to you, Stephen. Stephen, can you tell us maybe a little bit about, Clunview, about your setup and about your journey and how you've got to where you are today?
Well, it's a long story, but Clunview Farm was pretty much when we got involved with it. We were renting land from the original landowner, and she was so gracious enough, and the Lord led us in the direction of that farm when we were still working with horses. And although I had experience with farming livestock and sucklers previously, I wasn't as caught up on that. I was more into the horse end of things when we began renting land from Clunview Farm. And then over time, we built up a friendship with the original owner, and by the grace of God, she blessed us with this amazing farm that we were able to take over and own and run to our full capabilities. And she was so gracious to allow us to do so. It was a conventionally run farm, and it would have been very much so a monoculture of ryegrass and clover throughout. There would have been, saying that there would have been a section of it that is permanent pasture. So there would have been a small area of it that would have been a grove and orchards that would have been multi-species pasture that wouldn't have really been touched by tilling or anything like that, and since pre the famine even. So bar that, then then the rest of the farm would be a monoculture. And so we've progressed from there. About 9.5 years ago, we spent a lot of time in the States, and that influenced our decision on the way we wanted to go with the farm. We were influenced a lot by ranchers and by cattlemen and horsemen alike that led us down the road to the way we wanted to run the farm, which was more and more leaning towards regenerative. And about 9.5 years ago, we took the leap into progressing with trials to try to see if this could work, and increasing every year on that, building on from there to basically try to develop something that was sustainable, regenerative, that we could afford to run, that wouldn't cripple us, and that we wouldn't need a lot of inputs from outside the gate. So we began doing that, and that obviously then we immediately looked at the livestock, what type of livestock we wanted to run. There was a lot of deciding factors on the type of trials we were doing, whether the trials would work in this country, how could we adapt them to suit if they wouldn't work, or whether we needed to scrap them entirely and not use them whatsoever and come up with a different idea regarding Ireland and the climate here and the conditions and the weather and everything else. So that was a big deciding factor to how we would manage holistically the farm in its entirety.
Absolutely. No, that's brilliant, Stephen. So, I mean, the sense that I'm getting is that, you know, if you're not currently, so if you're a farmer watching this and you're not currently what's called regenerative, or you're not engaging in mob grazing, that it's not something you can do in 1 or 2 years. It's going to take quite some time and a lot of investment of effort, really, and knowledge, and really a change in mindset. How important is mindset, Stephen? And what would you say to someone who says, right, what's regenerative farming, or indeed what's mob grazing? Is the biggest thing, you know, in terms of, firstly, what are the practicalities of it, and do you need a change in mindset, Stephen?
Yeah, you do. There's certainly a large differential, I suppose, between what a lot of conventional guys like myself previously to going regenerative would have been doing, which would have been as a suckler farmer, cow-calf operation. I would have been letting my cattle out to set stock for maybe a week or more on a pasture before moving them to the next one. It would depend, obviously, but when you go through mob grazing in the common term that it's described in, or if you're into holistic plant grazing systems, that type of where you're utilizing mobs, where you're utilizing a bunched up herd of cattle or type of livestock to put pressure on soil and to increase soil structure and to build organic matter and all these other things. Your work ethic, your type of management that you need to adapt to has to be very quick at being able to adapt. If you foresee on things that are out of your control, elements of the weather, for example, soil conditions from weather, those type of things can ultimately make a success of your season, or it might mean you need to really find some gears and change very quickly. So being able to adapt with your grazing management, with your planned grazing management, that being able to adapt and being able to overcome problems that you might be aware might come up, but you don't foresee them when you start off. So, for example, on the slide here now, this is winter stockpile, and this is just a glimpse in what a pasture will be going through in winter. So we have winter stockpile grazed and trampled and resting on the left-hand side. That's pasture that has been grazed. We have a mobile drinker following the herd. Then we'll have our herd of cattle coming through and we'll have our polywire fence line front and back behind that herd. So we're trying to mimic the nature of the wild herd of ruminants as they would pass through and migrate through country. So we're doing it with polywire fence and with mobile drinkers, and in a way to build more and more carbon, and in a way to build more and more soil armor. So,
and we're just seeing, Stephen, here the contrast then between that winter shot and then here's a photo taken on the farm on the 2nd of July. So maybe you might just like to talk us through what we're actually seeing here in this image.
Well, between the first slide there with the winter and then now this summer, this is the very same pasture, and I think you nearly even spot that tree that's in the background on between the two photos. But basically, yeah, so the trees just over where it says winter stockpile grazed and trampled.
Yeah.
That's that same tree then that you see in the summer photo. So what we're seeing here is, again, on the 2nd of July, we document pretty much everything we do, because it's taking photos as a regenerative grazer. Taking photos is such an amazing help when you need to look back on previous years, and you can correspond and compare your information that you're getting from documenting photos, documenting your movements. So on the 2nd of July, we came into country there, and we trampled a lot of grasses and forbs. We put down a lot of carbon onto the soil, and underneath all of that and on top of it, you will have a lot of dung and urine. Now, the covering and the organic matter that's matted across the surface of the soil there is a key ingredient to making sure that our urine doesn't evaporate from the soil and end up back up into the atmosphere, where we want it to be trapped and down there, feeding that soil and the soil biology, the microorganisms that are working down underneath there. So the trampled grassland you see on the left from the mob, basically that is keeping our soils cooler in the summer, which means our microorganisms are working for longer, higher up into the topsoil that we're trying to build more and more of. So if we had a more traditional, conventional type graze system where the grass is ankle height and not where it is on that picture, which is above your knee, where we're about 80% maturity there. When you get that type of trampling effect from the herd, that type of herd impact, you're basically ensuring that your microorganisms are comfortable to work in the height of the summer when your soils are warmer. And when soils get too warm, microorganisms want to go back south and go back down to cooler temperatures, and vice versa then in the winter, where you've got the same issue, but you've got to allow them to work for longer. So that's part of the key. So then you see the herd moving across the path.
Yeah, so is the emphasis then really, Stephen, is it where, really there is a change in mindset required, where, I'm a conventional guy and I'm looking at that and I'm kind of saying, well, firstly, you've let the grass go to seed. So, the nutritional value for the animal is actually decreased, although, some people might say, well, actually, you're supplying enough fermentable roughage to the rumen. But is it that the mindset then has to change to actually, yes, we're feeding the animal, we're conscious of the animal, but we really want to feed the soil as well?
Yeah, well, I don't have to reseed. So allowing my pastures go to that level like that, where I have cattle moving in on country like that and trampling, and the seed is leaving the head of the grass or whatever it is, the species that it's growing from. I know that through doing this for as long as I have at this point, although I've certainly fallen flat on my face numerous times in the process of learning this, I know that I've no fear at all of grass as what you'd hear in a conventional system of getting away on you, is what would be the common term of seeing when grass goes to seed. Whereas what I'm trying to do there is trample grassland, allow the grass go to seed, leave the grass if necessary, but also I don't have to worry about the condition of my livestock, because of the type of animal I'm running is very set up for being able to do extremely well on different types of roughage and forage that they can adapt to, and we want our cattle working for us. We don't want to be working for them, so it's very important that we set up, when we started going into regenerative farming, that we went with the right type of livestock, and that for us personally was Belted Galloways and Black Galloways.
Fantastic, Stephen. So, maybe what I might do there now, Stephen, is just ask you to hold that thought. We're going to come back to some of those key issues around animal type and about, sort of overwintering, because what we want to do is, this is for farmers by farmers. We want to create an information-dense environment here, which is really useful for guys on the ground. But thanks, Stephen, and we'll be back to you now in a little while, but I just want to move over now to John. So John Deegan is a farm accountant and a part-time regenerative farmer from Kilbeggan in County Westmeath. John, how are you doing, sir? You're very, very welcome to the show. Thanks for coming
Thank you
on.
very much, Peter. Good evening.
John, could you tell us a little bit maybe about your own situation and your own setup and how that's going for you?
Well, I suppose a little bit of background on myself first. I'm the eldest of four, and basically all born and reared on a small farm just outside Kilbeggan in a place called Ballinagore. And my dad died when I was 8 in 1966. And we had an aunt living, and my grandfather was alive. My father's dad was alive. And myself and my brother, who was a few years younger than me, we used to do the as we used to call it, the job of milking the cows and feeding the pigs. It was a mixed farm. There was sheep, cattle, pigs, poultry, etc. on the farm at the time. But my dad had been in ill health for a good while before he died, and but we continued. My mother was what would be known as a townie. She had very little interest in. She wasn't a farmer's daughter or anything like that. So, but my aunt and my grandfather were there for a number of years afterwards, and we tried to. My mother tried to continue farming for a few years afterwards, but in about 1970, she rented the land to a neighbour, and myself and my brother, we went off to boarding school. She basically, I think, wanted us to get us away from farming. And unfortunately, my mum died in 1973 when I was 16 during my leaving cert year. But I went off to college and I in UCG, and then I went to Dublin and worked, trained as an accountant up there, and came home and started off after a few years working in Mullingar. I started a small accountancy practice in Kilbeggan. And during that time, my aunt was alive and the land was rented. Now it was farmers, mainly dry stock farming, but then there was a good bit of tillage at different times of the year as well. The land we're on the Escarida, basically right through the middle of Ireland, and parts of it is very, very sandy, not a huge amount of topsoil, and other parts of it is quite peaty, boggy, acidy soil. So there's a mixture there. In 1982, there was a section of it, about 17 acres, that I decided I wanted to get into forestry, and I sowed to much to my, I suppose, it's a problem now. I sowed Sitka spruce trees, which are actually ready for felling. I have a felling license in with the department at the moment. If you're watching Pippa, you can see what you can do about it. But anyway, at that stage then, I wasn't that terribly interested in farming. It was about maybe 15 or 16 years ago. Farmers were coming into me. Mainly, there wouldn't be a huge amount of dairy farming up this part of the world. It would be mainly suckler farming, dry stock farming, some tillage, and there obviously are some dairy farms as well. But what I was seeing was farmers were getting their subsidies and they were spending them trying to keep their business going. And to me, that didn't make sense. I couldn't understand why a farmer couldn't mainly stick his subsidy in his bank and keep it there for the rainy day. And if he couldn't make a few bob out of his farming enterprise, then he really shouldn't have been at it as far as I was concerned. And basically, he should really be cutting his costs. In other words, if you cut your costs, then you have to make a profit, as far as I was concerned. So I was trying to advise some farmers in relation to cutting costs. And of course, then I said, well, sure, maybe I can try it myself. So I started to do a bit of research into the different things. And I came across a chap called Joel Salatin on YouTube, who was a farmer in Virginia in America. And he was doing this thing called regenerative farming. And I looked at his YouTube videos, I bought his books, and through that I got to know a good few more farmers of a similar vein all around the world. And I studied the regenerative farming. So I decided I would do that. At the time in 2005, through my daughter who had an interest in horses, I bought heavy horses, Shires and Clydesdales. I was breeding those. And there was about 30 acres that they had free rein on. And I basically just let them out, let them run around, let them graze wherever they went. And after about 4 or 5 years, I started to notice a huge amount of weed. Now, I do know that horses are different to cattle and sheep, and they're allegedly harder on land than cows or sheep or goats or whatever. But I couldn't understand this. There was an awful lot of thistles, and docks, nettles, ragwort, etc. And I wouldn't use herbicides or pesticides. I didn't want to use that. But I just said I couldn't understand that this was happening to the land. And as I came across the regenerative farming, all of a sudden just something clicked in my mind when I had read about the mob grazing. So I said I'd try that for a year, and I tried that with the horses for a year, but the horses weren't really paying for me. So I decided I'd get into a few cattle. So in 2017, I decided to get into dairy cows, not dairy, but cows and calves, suckler cows. So I bought my first cows at that stage. And since then, I have been basically using mob grazing to regenerate the soil. And slightly different to Stephen earlier in that my land, of course, I happened to run into two very, very dry year. 2018, the summer from practically June until September, there was no rain, which meant that there was practically no growth with me. And then last summer or last spring, this time during lockdown from about the early March until I can remember, it was the last Thursday in June when it actually started to rain and then didn't stop into 2020. But both of those were very, very hard on my dry land. I practically no growth at all in those periods. So that set me back a fair bit on the plans I had and the grass growth. And I had to buy in. I don't cut my own. I buy in haylage or square bales of hay. I don't possess a tractor. All my calving is done outdoors. My cattle are outwintered, and I basically just set up paddocks and move them every day or twice a day sometimes, and with mobile electric fencing and mobile water systems. And I'm finding that my grass is improving. I would think that, unlike Stephen, my ground had been reseeded for over a number of years and over a number of periods. And I'd say, as well as that, with the tillage on it, it was heavily fertilized. It would have been sprayed, a lot of pesticides, a lot of insecticides, and everything else on it. And the farmers who had it at the time would have been all conventional farmers. They would have been considered very, very proper farmers, doing it the right way according to what they were told by Chagas, etc. So therefore, they would have been dosing and injecting and all that kind of thing. So my ground I would have had a lot of work to do with it to try and get it to regenerate back up, to try and get the bacteria and the fungi back working again. And also, I think the grasses that we are now sowing, I think they've been genetically modified to such an extent that I think they almost require chemical fertilizers, that it takes them a while almost to get used to the natural way of growing again. And that seems to be a problem. I'm finding that when I let the grass grow and the litter, when it's walked down by the cows, I think our temperate climate and our damp climate is not quite as brittle as in a lot of these places that are using mob grazing, where the cattle walk in and the grass is quite mature and it breaks off and then it falls on the ground. Grass in Ireland tends to grow that little bit longer. So I think that we occasionally will have to graze it, or at least I will have to in my case, and I'm doing it at the moment, which is grazing it quite tight, and I'm going to let it grow then for a long period, let it grow back up to something like what Stephen has in Kilkenny, let's say, up towards your knee, and then graze it off and let the cattle in and walk it down at that stage. But I think I am going to, in order to thicken up the grass, I'm afraid the grass is getting a bit like the top of my head. There's not an awful lot growing on it in spots. So in order to try and thicken up the grass and get the sward to thicken up, and also if you let the grass grow long, a la Stephen, it doesn't tiller when it's grazed, and it doesn't thicken up. And when the grass then is walked down, it can have an effect that the sunlight doesn't get to it. And while that, I think, works on the older pasture, and I have a few fields that are old pasture that have never been ploughed, it seems to be working fine there. But on the let's say the tillage fields, the fields that were where there was corn and beet and stuff like that sown over the years, and there's relatively new grass seed in it, I don't think that grass seed is as robust or as the older grass seeds, and therefore I have to mind it or change the way I look at it. I think one very important thing for any farmer who wants to get into mob grazing is you need to walk it very regularly and to be very observant of everything, because every field is different, every part of a field is different. And I think that's the most important thing. I'm not really into technology. I don't believe in measuring grass or taking soil samples or anything like that. And grass will grow if you give it a chance, give it enough time, and give it enough rest, and let the bacteria and the fungi get active. I think grass will grow and you will be well rewarded, and it won't cost you anything.
Great, John. I mean, just absolutely, John. Thanks very much for that contribution. A couple of things. I did notice that you said there at one point, the grass has been genetically modified. We probably should just clarify that, in that case, that's talking about, traditional sort of breeding practices probably over the last 50 years, which chime into, the sort of, I suppose, the conventional wisdom now that perennial ryegrass is, and look, it's like the Sitka spruce, it's like black and white cows. It's these were, it's not that the advice was wrong back in the day, but it was of its time, and we're just realizing now that we need to be a little bit different. That some of these things we need to be a bit more adaptable, I suppose, is the message coming through, guys. John, two things there, just very quickly, if I can just get you to tease out, because I want to tease this out a bit more with Stephen as well. You said there about, you've a few animals there. How important in your system is having the right animal? And second part of this question is, your grazing infrastructure. So like your poly wires and your piping and so on, how important is that in actually making the system work? And while it's, there's a lot of labor involved and there's daily moves and so on, how can you actually make the job, a lot easier? And I think we have a couple of pictures as well that maybe we can show as you talk us through this, John.
Well, I think the one thing I studied at the time was to make sure that all my calving would be done on their own. I wasn't going to get up in the middle of the night, but I don't have the experience with cows calving and things like that. So I got myself a Speckled Park bull, which is a Canadian breed, which is a cross of Hereford, Angus, English White, and I think there's another one in there as well, a European breed. And even though it was actually bred in Canada, and they're a very, very easy calving bull. They're a small animal, and they're very placid. And I just bought, I looked around and I bought some heifers and some cows. I bought some Speckled Park cross. I brought a couple of Hereford Friesian crosses. They were out of dairy animals. I bought some native Irish Drimmons, which are also very, very hardy, very like the Speckled Park actually, in both colour and an easy calving and temperament. And so I've had 3 years calving. I'm in the middle of calving at the moment, and I have not seen a calf born. I walk out in the morning or in the evening, and there's a new calf suckling.
Calf is on the ground.
Yeah, the calf is not only on the ground; he's up suckling. He's actually
absolutely. Well, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't actually. I've never seen one. Even I had two heifers. I remember buying, and I remember a neighbour of mine was looking at them, and he said, "God, they're going to have trouble calving." Because they were relatively small and small pelvises, etc. And he commented on that. No problem. They've produced calves for me every year, no problem. And that's what I want. I don't want to have. Now, you may say, I have a neighbour who is, and he won't mind me saying so, he passes by me every day, and he just passed a comment that my cattle, and he would be a man whose opinion I would respect in relation to his opinion on cattle, and he just passed a comment that he thought that my bull was producing fabulous calves out of a different variety of cows. In relation to, I think it's important when you're setting, if you're thinking about going into this, I move my cattle every day and I set up paddocks. I originally designed my paddocks so that I set up semi-permanent fencing. And I have all my poly wires 50 meters long. They're I have a semi-permanent wire around most of my fields. My fields are not terribly big. I have a 10-acre field, a couple of 6-acre fields, and they're smaller fields. And what I did was I put semi-permanent fencing approximately 40 yards from the ditch right around the field, so that I was able to run a a polywire then across so that I can make the paddocks daily, whatever size I wanted. And basically all I'm using is baler twine to connect it there. You can see to the fence in that particular thing, that particular photograph. And I have mobile energizers, solar powered energizers or solar batteries for my electric fencing. I also only run the fencing. I have it so that I can turn it off. It's not going all around the field. It's only going to the particular paddocks that I want it to every time, so that I'm not wasting power and that there's a good lot of energy in the battery every time. My watering system is 1/2-inch hydrodair piping, which I have around each field. And my portable. Now I only have about 30 cattle, all told, between cows and calves and yearlings and 2-year-olds. And as there's a hierarchy with herds, I have a wheelbarrow. I think it's there on the photograph, and I have basically I just pull the pipe. I just take up. I have a stake there which keeps the wire down, and it's always behind them so that they're not trying to reach in over it to get at grass. It's always behind where they're after grazing. And I just take off the pipe, pull the pipe along the ground along with the barrow, and set it up at the next wire. It takes about, you were talking about work, it's actually not very easy because the cattle now are waiting for me to move them. I'd say it's the same with Stephen every day. They're waiting at the fence to see me coming, and they know they're going into the next paddock because they've seen me set it up the previous day or the previous. I can set up paddocks a couple of days or even a week in advance if I'm going away. So the work during the summertime, there's practically no work involved really, apart from setting up the paddocks and moving the barrow, which takes 5 minutes. You can watch the cattle then as they pass by you into the next paddock and see that they're all there and all healthy and whatever. And you just take a look at it. You love to hear them when they start eating the grass, the munching. It brings me back to my childhood, listening to the cows in the shed when they'd be milking them. So that's my system. It's very, very simple.
Brilliant, John.
Very easy.
That's
fantastic. Low cost.
John.
Very, very low cost.
John, that's a fantastic contribution. Thanks very, very much. We're going to go back to Stephen now. So, Stephen, I think when we left there, and we'll get you maybe to discuss, the fencing and the water and the infrastructure that you have. But we wanted to touch really on the type of animal that you're running, and why is it that you think the animal you have fits the system you have? Can you maybe talk about having the right animal for the right system, and make it specific to your own case?
Yeah, so I suppose growing up, I was always around Angus and Simmental type cross, black whiteheads, black baldy types that are Hereford Angus cross or British Frisian Angus cross, British Frisian Hereford cross. And when we started to take over Clunview Farm, it was important to me because we didn't inherit a herd. The farm didn't have any livestock and didn't really have much infrastructure, if any, for livestock like cattle. It was important for me to have the right type of animal to suit what we were going to be going down the road of with holistic plant grazing, mob grazing management. So for me, I had two choices. My favorite was Aberdeen Angus, and Aberdeen Angus are extremely rare and hard to find. The true native traditional Aberdeen Angus is on the highly endangered list in the UK, so it's a very, very hard animal to get. Whereas the other option was the traditional Angus that we see that have Canadian genetics influenced bloodlines, and are a more modern type framed animal, larger, and also have more in the line of calving issues and other genetic issues that we're seeing more and more of from these more modern genetics. Whereas so that was kind of ruling me out from going down the Angus route right there. So then I kind of had the option of looking around, and I decided that the next animal I would be choosing for will be the Galloway, the Belgian Galloway. And they never were a mainstream breed, and because of that, their natural instincts they're very in tune with. Their capabilities to forage the way they do, and the way they can calve down, and the way they can mother up and cover country, and just being incredibly good working cattle. And it was for that reason that we wanted to go down that road. They were definitely not the mainstream, and because of that, they weren't messed with like your modern Angus would be now, or your modern Hereford. So we went down with the Belted Galloway, and we always had in our mind that we want these animals to work for us. We don't want to be working for them. We want them working for us, and we want to work alongside them. So having animals that can calve down by themselves, having animals that can outwinter by themselves and not need people, because that was a very important point for me, because I don't always have the time to be in and around livestock and, calving down difficult calvings and all these types of issues. So I wanted animals that were able to look after themselves and weren't afraid of a storm or two. And that's certainly what I got with the Galloways. So when it comes to the type of management we do with them, they're the type of hide they have, the type of coat they have, their characteristics all lead themselves to pretty much being totally independent. And so they're not the type of animals you're ever going to see hunkered under a hedge in the middle of a storm. When you will, with your thinner skinned, single coated type animal, you will see them hunkered under a hedge somewhere trying to just let the storm blow by. Yep. Where with the Galloways, you'll just see them right out there in the middle of it, and they'll just be grazing away, working away for me. And that's kind of really pleasing to me, because it reassures me that I made the right decision. Calving issues, there isn't any. Vet costs, there isn't any except for the TB test, which is standard in Ireland every year. So so like the Belted Galloways and the Black Galloway really suit the grass-fed, finish on grass system, where they're able to forage for stuff that other cattle wouldn't eat, like docks and rushes and things like that. Like they would really go to town on them, so long as your management is right. Obviously, they're not going to choose beans when they can have steak. So it's important that you adapt and you suit your setup, your pastures, your paddocks to fit the country you're going into, to have your cattle do the most for you. So that picture there is winter stockpile. So that's what we will have going into winter to start out our outwintering systems. And again, what you're seeing there with the grass at my knee height, that's pasture that's been closed since last August. So, and then I will be coming into that maybe in November or going into December. And that's the type of forage that we have in front of that cow herd. And then the stockpile, as you can see, as they come in on it, that stockpile is acting as an organic carpet layer, like soil armor, to cushion the blow of the hoof against the soil, so that the soil ultimately is being protected and the soil structure is being protected, and there's not runoff from soil heading out of the field and into a ditch. And so the type of stockpile is critical to outwintering, and I can't emphasize that enough regarding the outwintering system. But having the right type of cattle, the right type of weight of cattle going into outwintering is very important. Like, I wouldn't dream of running Continentals, Limousines, Charlies in an outwintering system. I wouldn't dream of doing it unless I was in a country that had far harder ground and far drier winters. But with what we got here in Ireland, with the amount of rain that we're getting here, and the soil conditions, and our farm is on very heavy soil. 50% of it will be marginal. We have a floodplain. We have, there's a lot of different issues going on, especially in winter, a lot of challenges. So having the right type of cattle that can adapt and suit to those environments is really, really important for our success, if we're successful with our outwintering. And if we're not successful with our outwintering, ultimately that comes down to my poor management. It isn't necessarily the system or the cattle, it's how I manage that. And if I screw up, then I only have myself to blame.
And just picking up on something you've said there, Stephen, in terms of having the cattle working for you. So, we're moving away. So again, we're emphasizing the change in mindset, and we're moving away just from actually, getting the grass into the cattle and having the cattle growing. So it's not just about the cattle growing in the field as such, but the cattle really being used as ecological tools. So it's the cattle actually cycling nutrients in the field, and trampling in grass and creating the conditions to create more soil, improve soil organic matter, and actually grow more grass.
Yeah, like if you're not building topsoil, you're not building fertility, and then you're not going to be in the cattle business very long. Especially if you're regenerative, where you don't have your inputs that you can go down to the co-op for. So if you're wanting to run livestock in a regenerative system with low cost, you've got to think about building topsoil, building soil fertility, putting down carbon through sequestration. And all of that is key to the ruminants management, how it is managed across a piece of pasture, how it moves through country, how it migrates, and how you manage the migration it's absolutely critical to your success, or you'll be finding regenerative farming very frustrating. So here's our summer. This would be where to the far left corner photo, that part of the photo would be before the livestock move in. Then to the right, obviously, you can see some of the herd is in there pushing through country. And then you can see on the bottom left, we have a Gallagher tumble-wheel fence where we have trampled pasture strip on the left and not trampled on the right. And then what we have on the right-hand side is trampled. The foreground is trampled. The background where the cattle are is new pasture they just gone into, where they plan to spend the next 24 hours trampling. Now, what John was saying regarding brittle grasses and brittle forbs, and how certain regions in the world trampled pasture can look different to another area in the world. That's very true. Like if you take, for example, in the States, where I would be doing a lot of my focusing on trampled grassland, you go onto a trampled grassland, everything is matted down. It's broke because the stem is far drier. There's far less juice in it, and it's far easier to crimp. Whereas, and that applies with no-till guys who are arable that might be watching. So you've got a different environment, totally different set of challenges, but you have a different environment that can allow for more trampling, that can create crimping. And a nice flat thatch mat that goes across your surface of your pasture. Whereas in Ireland, where we trample, there's so much juice in them stems that they bounce back up. A lot of them do. Now you still get a lot that tramples down, but you get another opportunity maybe to go in there and trample again if you're adaptive enough and if you can adjust to do it. And not overstay your welcome after being in there once already. But ultimately, what we like to do is we graze into country like that at about 75 to 80% maturity, and then after they graze through that country, they don't see that again for about 80 days. If we're coming into the end of our summer, we will graze into pasture, and then once it's done, they mightn't see that again for another 150 days when they come into winter stockpile. So this is just a photo that I had done up where it was the emphasis on turning a monoculture to a polyculture, really. The correct management of the cattle hooves, how cattle are managed, and the importance of aeration and the split toes on a cow's hoof has a huge part to play in soil structure build and into topsoil build and into ultimately putting down carbon. So building fertility and all the rest of it, and feeding microorganisms. It all comes down to how them hooves are used, how they're managed, what way you're placing them out there. So we can, on photo 1, you can see where we have a cow's hoof literally trampling organic matter into the soil, onto the surface of the soil. And then you can see number 2 is a photo of that coming. That was number 1 was a summer. Number 2 was a winter, where you can see the footprints dented into the stockpile of where a cow is moved through country there. And then you can see photo 3, which is what's left after the cow is finished on photo 2, which is left, which you have is organic matter trampled. You have your soil armor put down. You have your carbon down on there. You have your humus going in. You've got your dung deposits, literally as much as you can get. You want to be stumbling over it. Ideally, a grazer wants to see as many dung pies, maybe every 4 foot, 5 foot apart. And then the following year, after you get that going on, you get photo 4, or the photo on number 4 there, which is basically a monoculture turned into a polyculture, and increasing so long as your management can stay within the principles, but always being holistic in the way you approach it. So that's how we're able to convert a monoculture farm to a polyculture without the inputs from the co-op, and your fertilizers, and using machinery and seed and everything else. But certainly there are other places where seed's needed, and there's certainly the places where lime might be needed. But they are in very rare situations if you're dealing with grasslands.
That's fantastic, Stephen. I mean, a big issue I just want to touch on really is this issue of stocking density, because we've been trained to think that stocking density is just a certain number of animals or a certain live weight over a certain, given area. And really with holistic, I think, is it fair to say that there's the time element of stocking is key as well? And how do you actually match, or is it tricky? I imagine it's pretty difficult to match the actual demand of the animals with the growth of the grass. And can you talk a little bit about sort of hitting that sweet spot where you don't want to on the one hand have to bring in animals, and on the other hand have to get rid of animals, because obviously your objective is not to have to bring in bagged feed to compensate. So you want to hit that optimum. Can you maybe just talk about trying to match demand with what the ground is able to do?
Yeah, well, that depends on what system you want to run. So if you're going to every farm is different. So each guy that decides he may want to go down this road has to look at what he knows of his farm. And from that point there, you can begin to curtail, and you know how far you can push the boundaries from a conventional perspective. So when you go down the regenerative route, stocking rate can be very different to stocking rate in a conventional system. So whereas for me personally, and I know maybe John might be totally different in this regard, but for the way I manage things, and I know loads of guys like that wouldn't do it the way I do it, and they're incredible grazers. They're very highly sought after and respected people. But my own system and how I've set it up for me, outwintering is critical for me. It's so important that I get outwintering right, and it is my foundation for that starts back in the summertime around about June. So regarding the stocking density, when I start coming into June, I begin to get a very good flush of grass and forbs coming up. I have a lot of species of grasses coming through, and I see it as probably the ultimate time to start preparing my stockpiles for coming into the winter time. Shortly after you get past July, you're really focusing on winter. So from June, that's kind of when I start to build my blocks. So I'm getting the trampling right. I'm getting that soil organic matter down to make sure that we don't cause poaching and all the rest in winter. But ultimately, what I can run in the summer is not what I can run in the winter from a stocking rate perspective. So what I can go with in the summertime, leading into summer, I definitely do not necessarily want that leading into October, November, December. And so for me, I've designed the way I manage it regarding I don't finish for beef. My system is very on a North American type concept where I have a cow herd that follows around me on that farm all the year, but the calves are weaned off in September, October when they're ready to be weaned, and then they head down the road. And what I'm left with there is my cow herd that I focus on then for the rest of the winter until they're calving down again with calves. So my stocking rate, if I have 20 or 30 head of cows going through winter, and then I come into the summer and I feel right, I could really do with another 10 or 15 head here. Well, then my option is either to buy in and then hold them through. So buy in stores or buy in lightweight cattle, hold them through and put weight on them so they're not actually balancing off. They're always gaining for the time that they're running with on my operation. And so then by the time they get to September, I'm sending them for sale, or they're heading down the road. They're no longer going to be with me. And so those animals go away again. And then what I'm left with is my original cow herd along with their calves, and then their calves get weaned and then they go away. And then what I'm left with going into winter is the cow herd. And that's kind of how I focus it. It's a way for me to simplify things, because winter is such a difficult time, and it's vital that I get it right as much as I can, and that I can adapt. And I can't adapt if I've got steers here and another bunch of heifers there, and I've got a bunch of bulls in some other place and the cow herd going around. So I have to be able to suit my farm. Some other guy could do very much so more than what I can do on that regard. But for me, that's the way I've adapted. But stocking rate, for a regenerative perspective, it's not clear cut. It's very hard to answer it, because you've certainly got scope to increase more so with regenerative than you do the conventional in the growing season. But I feel personally that I need to decrease going into winter, because I outwinter. If I wasn't outwintering, maybe it wouldn't be such an issue.
Okay, so I mean, and obviously, you know, as you're saying, the outwintering, the choice of animal is key, but being able to outwinter is really paring off a whole rake of costs from the operation. But then, you know, I suppose just looking at it from the point of view of a farmer who isn't involved in this, then, Stephen, and there's really two issues, and I want to touch on one of them with John afterwards as well. You know, you want to hit that kind of, you know, that matching the demand. So you don't want to have to bring in animals, although you could say offtake with bale grazing, because obviously that has maybe a biosecurity implication. But the thing that's always intrigued me is if I presume that, you know, there's a time factor. Guys are going to make mistakes. They really can't be too hard on themselves. If you're overstocked and you had, you know, for guys that might run into problems, how key is it, do you think, in terms of having a what I might call a release valve, to have something like a local abattoir network? I mean, do you see that, or even for guys? I mean, for example, Clive Bright is finishing with regenerative mob grazing up in Sligo. How important do you think? And I'll ask you, Stephen, and I'll come to you, John, afterwards with the same question. How important do you think, in terms of just nationally pivoting the system towards more adaptive, regenerative mob grazing, how important do you think it is to have sort of a network of local accessible abattoirs where, you know, they act as a release valve?
Oh, absolutely. Like it's hugely critical or hugely important to have such a thing. But unfortunately, Ireland lag way behind on that front, and it's worrying to see the trend of the lack of availability of such a service. But certainly we're fairly blessed here. We have two different butchers we can use, but there are certainly places where you got to travel some distance to find someone who can take your cattle, and the amount of restrictions, the amount of red tape has excelled the problem, has increased the problem. But that is going forward. I think going into the future, if there is something that needs focus on, it's how to get local abattoirs back, how to get butchers back on the streets, and that can kill out cattle and that can provide a service that is top notch. To be perfectly frank with you.
Fantastic, Stephen.
But I think ultimately that's something that maybe there's a lot of people not looking at, but it's certainly something that definitely needs to be looked at. And along with a blow-off valve, a release valve, like from the perspective of running stock in winter, obviously, like nobody's going to be criticizing anybody that needs to run cattle into a shed. You know, you're not going to destroy your ground for the sake of outwintering. You know, you're going to have to do things. You're going to have to curtail if you make a mistake, if you overshoot something, if you don't foresee something, or if just something out of the blue happens to all of us. We have to be able to find some gears and hustle and get somewhere with our herd that either to other pasture or into a holding or into a set of corrals or into a shed where we can hold or keep building on what we have been building the previous year and not deplete it. So but certainly getting back to the meat side of things, that's a subject that needs a lot of attention that isn't really getting it.
Okay, great stuff, Stephen. Stephen, thank you very much for that contribution. Just to follow up, John, the same question to you in terms of sort of that release valve, local abattoir networks. If we're going to roll this out, or if there was any kind of an aspiration, and look, we're not saying, we're right and everyone else is wrong, but it's just that it gives people flexibility and it gives people options. And if more people want to sort of adopt mob grazing or regenerative type systems, how important do you think it is to, have that local abattoir network as that kind of release valve, as guys just, get into that mindset of and the practice of matching supply with numbers?
Well, I think in relation to the local abattoir, I think it's absolutely vital. Unlike, I'm not as far down the road as Stephen is in relation to the length of time I'm at the mob grazing. So therefore, I don't have the situation where my first calves are only just going to be going for slaughter this year. However, I'm lucky enough that I have an abattoir 100 yards from where I'm sitting on the main street in Kilbeggan. It's one of the few that's left in the county at the moment. And there's a lot of pressure on them. I mean, the amount of red tape that goes on is simply incredible from the department or from vets. I know there is obviously a requirement in relation to food safety, etc. But I think for small, local, family-run abattoirs, or relatively small, where there's a very small throughput, I think we need to do something in relation to that. Just in relation to like regenerative grazing involves no grain. I don't feed any grain or anything. Everything that I feed is pasture or hay or haylage. I try not to feed. I will feed silage if it's absolute. I think I fed one bale of silage to an animal since I started. I don't want to feed silage because it's fermented grass and they fermented themselves in their stomach. Also, I think in relation to, I want to kill my own animals. I want to see them born and I want to see them die, in the sense that I want to mind them. And I want them, my pastures is very mixed forms. In other words, I have lots of different grasses. I have lots of different forage. And I think that's very important for the food element, for the nutrient element, for the micronutrient element, for the vitamins that that people are eating. And there's a lot of people out there at the moment who want cattle, who want to eat meat, want to eat red meat, want to eat fat red meats, and get the nutrients and the vitamins out of that. And you will get that with regenerative grazing. And as a result, I really don't want to sell all my animals. I want to get all mine slaughtered locally. There's a butcher, as I said, in Quebec, and there's another one down in County Offaly, which looks after people like me and will do what I want with them. Mm-hmm. And I like to, I think at least until I go sell, I suppose I won't know. But I have a lot of people who are willing to buy off me at the moment.
Oh, that's very encouraging, John.
Yeah, where they want to know where their meat comes from. And I can guarantee that my meat is number one, it's organic, even though I'm not actually registered organic. I'm actually beyond organic because I won't allow any grain or anything like that. Nothing but pasture and grass, and that's it. And I think that is absolutely vitally important. I have to agree 100% with everything that Stephen has said. Just one other thing in relation to, I suppose, the mob grazing is that you have to be very, very flexible. And you were talking about either selling off cattle or bringing in cattle, depending on grass growth. You really have to be very flexible, because the weather here is so variable. I mean, I've had 2 very, very hard summers with very dry weather, which is very hard on my very, very dry soils. And as a result, I've had problems. And you have to be able to vary your plans in that regard. There's no way that you can plan in January for the year. It's just not possible. You sometimes have to plan week to week or day to day. Number one, you have to change the size of paddocks. Sometimes you go out and you plan maybe that this field is going to last for X number of weeks or whatever days, as the case may be. And you realize that it hasn't rained, or the grass hasn't grown, or there's bits of it that are just is not as good as elsewhere. And you just have to change the size of your paddock, either increase it or decrease it. But that's the one thing you were very, very flexible with the mob grazing. And you obviously need to give the soil. I mean, I don't know whether we've gone through exactly what the mob grazing entails, but what you're doing is you're moving them every day, or maybe even twice a day, depending on the time of year. And they're basically just getting fed grass. Another thing actually that crossed my mind there was this 30-month rule. I think that really has to go for grass-fed cattle. I think that, I mean, certain types of cattle and certain, I think that it's a ridiculous rule to be in at the moment. I know it was brought in at a particular time and a particular to deal with mad cow disease, etc., or to try and get rid of it. But I think it's been abused at this stage for various different reasons. I won't go into at the moment. So that's another thing that I think we need to sort. And I think a lot of farmers in the suckler area or the dry stock area would like to see that particular rule thrown out the window at this stage. It serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever.
Yeah, I think we'd probably we'd have large agreement on that, John. I think, John, we were actually right up against the wire here, but we're not on the telly, so we do have a little bit of leeway. John, in your role, I just wanted to go to one final question to you, because we can't let you go without sort of saying that in your role as a farm accountant, and I just want to say that we're actually. We're having some very good questions as well. We could have touched on so many more. We had a very good question about mob grazing and carbon farming. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get through all the questions tonight, but I think that means one thing. John and Stephen, we're probably going to have to invite you guys back at some stage. Hopefully if we do another series. But John, in your role as a farm accountant, I'm a conventional suckler farmer and the numbers are not stacking up. And I'm kind of thinking, you know what, I'm getting on a little bit, and I have a laddies away at college. I'm kind of thinking maybe a set in the land, or maybe I'm not really as interested and I'm not as passionate as I was, and the numbers aren't stacking up. And in the context of the discussion we've had this evening, what advice would you give to that client as his accountant?
Well, I think you should seriously look at regenerative farming, mob grazing, for a couple of different reasons. To give an example, I had a client. He's a man now. He's retirement age. He was always a very, very good conventional farmer. Would be well respected as a conventional farmer, but he wasn't making as much money as he thought he should be. And I just said to him, I said, cut back. Don't spend as much on feedstuffs. Cut down your animals. Do more grazing, and a few little tips here and there. He wasn't going to go regenerative farming. He wasn't going to mob graze because, for the simple reason, he's probably gone beyond the stage where he's going to do it at this stage. But I just I said, cut your costs and everything. And he actually came into me after we did his accounts and did his tax returns this year, and he said to me, it's the first year I still have my subsidy in the bank. It's the second year. This year was the second year he had his subsidy still in his bank account. And from a few small changes. And he's a suckler farmer. So, and I think anyone who wants to go regenerative, from my point of view, it's a no-brainer. It's you don't spend. I see the big expenses on a farmer's profit and loss account are contractors where they don't have their own contracting equipment, fertilizers, feedstuffs, and veterinary. And if you can cut down, like Stephen, he mentioned earlier, he doesn't see his vet except for testing. I'm the same thing. I think I had one calf born that had a navel infection, and that's the only time I saw my vet for anything except testing. So, I mean, I don't contribute to the pharmaceutical industry at all, I'm afraid, or to the grain industry.
John, that's again, as a in sort of 3 minutes, that's a really concise answer.
Anyone who probably knows me and who happens to hear about this on me will say, "What is that so and so doing on there? What would he know about farming?" Well, I'm just saying at the moment that I've had 3 years of calving and 3 years of cows. I've not seen a vet. And my cattle are looking quite well, I think.
That's fantastic, John, and that's that's really, I think, a positive and a hopeful note to sign off on tonight, folks. We've actually run.
Sorry, can I stop you one more thing? Just in relation to the environment.
There's no ads following us, John, so you're okay.
I have not birds. I have everything, all back on the land. As a matter of fact, the swallows are there every summer. When they're actually waiting for me to move the cattle in, and they're ready to troop, because the minute the cattle go into the grass, the insects are rising, and I basically have to duck and dive with the swallows around the place. So there's lots of biodiversity and lots of animals and birds and everything back around the place.
And that's absolutely crucial, John. And again, you know, we could probably sit here for another hour, I've no doubt whatsoever, with you guys and have a really, you know, as I've said before, to kind of raise an information-rich environment and something which practical farmers on the ground are going to get a lot of value from. But unfortunately, folks, we've run right up against the clock at the end of this first episode of our new Farming, Food and Rural Affairs program, Grassroots. So the first thing I'd like to do again, just to reiterate, a big thank you to the Irish Inquiry and all the backroom team who've put in some Trojan work and some really good work and a lot of effort over the last few weeks to get us to a point where we could go live to air. Also, I'd like to thank Stephen and John for coming on and being generous with their time for the show. Unfortunately, sadly, we didn't get to meet Jennifer tonight, but I think the kids were still up. But Stephen, some things are more important, so that's absolutely no problem. I'm sure we'll be in touch with yourself and Jennifer again. But as I say, lads, thanks very much for making this what I hope was a very information-rich, a very constructive, a very informative, and hopefully a very interesting program. So, at the end of our first program, all that's left for me to say is to thank you all for watching, for tuning in next week. Please, you know, feel free to comment with suggestions, observations, recommendations in the comments section. You will also be able to look back at the show. But for now, and until we see you next week, go maybe dirashli chéile an teachtain sechuin slán go fóil agus banachtaí ormh go léir. From Grassroots, good night.